Hello again, this is Coach Robert with a video about knights. Recently I was talking to someone who is just getting into chess and seems to be progressing pretty well, but they said that they've been having trouble figuring out how to effectively use the knights. And I had a thought when I was talking to them about it, that the knights, even though they have a reputation for being something that is easier to handle when you're starting out, as opposed to bishops where stronger players usually handle the bishops better, I do think that knights also pose unique challenges to starting players, not necessarily because of their non-linear jumpy ability. I think the difficulty for players in understanding the knight's movement is overstated. What's difficult is that the knight interacts with the pawns in an interesting way compared to the other pieces, because it's a short-range piece as well, just like the pawn. And this means that to use the knights very effectively, you also need to have some kind of good understanding of the pawns and what they do. So I thought to make this video about the knight and its personality, which has to do specifically with how the knight relates to the pawns, and also its relative strength in different kinds of pawn situations compared to the other pieces. So the traits that I will be talking about today include the need of a knight for an advanced support point in order to be an effective piece. An advanced support point is kind of like an outpost square. An outpost square is like a square where you can't be challenged whatsoever. But an advanced support point means it's inconvenient for them to drive you away. It doesn't have to be a full outpost square. So basically the knight needs some kind of good squares, and we'll talk about how you can identify squares like that. Knights are also strong in closed positions. This is really important to understand. So if you don't know the difference between a closed position and an open position, you should check out my video about that same topic that recently came out. Knights are also very good blockaders, so we'll talk about how knights can stand well in front of pawns in particular. They're sort of like the natural predator of the pawns, although pawns also can get their vengeance against the knight sometimes too. And we're also going to talk about an anti-knight technique, which basically entails the deprivation of the support points for the knight. And the way that I'm structuring this is sort of loosely based on Silman's writing about the knight. I disagree with Silman on many points in chess, because I think he emphasizes a very formulaic and artificial way of looking at chess, but I do think that he sometimes picked good examples and touched on important aspects of chess. And I think one area where he was successful as a chess writer was in talking about the knights. So we'll see some examples. This first example, which is already on the board, is about that first idea that knights need advanced support points. And this position is black to play. I decided to frame this partly as an explanation and partly as a series of examples. So if you're watching this, you could also pause and decide what to do here. I'm not going to just tell the move right away. I think that we should talk about what the advanced support point concept is. So in this example, we actually have outpost squares. Outpost squares are places where if you put a higher value piece, it's supported by a pawn and cannot be easily driven away. In this example, for white, there's an outpost square on d5. And if you want to pause here as a mini puzzle, you could say, where is the outpost square for black? Black's outpost square is right here. You can see that they are each supported by a pawn of their own color. And while these squares may be contested, for instance, we have this bishop attacking d4, it is nevertheless an outpost square. And part of the strategy for outpost squares is to occupy them at some critical moment, but you don't want to just occupy them straight away, which is part of why this is even a puzzle at all for black. If you just play the move knight d4, they could snap it off with bishop takes d4, pawn takes d4, and then after knight d5, you can see there's no way that black will ever get rid of the knight on d5, because that is a light square and the bishop is on dark and it will never move to the other color. So this means if you play knight d4 directly, you'll have a problem as black strategically. You might still hold the game, but if we want to fight for a win and have a really good game, we should probably not just play knight d4 immediately, even though that is the best place for the knight in this position, being an outpost square. I would call this only an advanced support point if there was, for example, a pawn on c2, because when you occupy d4, they could still play c3 to kick you out. But it might be inconvenient for your opponent to actually drive your piece away. So even if you can't stay there forever, because a pawn might chase you away at some point, you should still consider occupying squares like that. It's also worth mentioning that sometimes, in order to trade the piece on the outpost square, your opponent has to concede something because maybe they don't want to trade that piece. So it's a little bit of a nuanced thing. The main thing, though, is whether or not pawns can chase you away. If the higher value pieces have to chase you away, it might require them to take their attention from other important areas of the board, and so in that sense, it might still be good to threaten to go on the outpost. So here, I'm going to tell the move for black in a second about what we should do in this situation. If we want to put a knight on d4, we should start with bishop g5. The reason for this is that the bishop has nowhere to run, we can trade it off, and then play knight d4. And at least in this position, it's equal, if not better. The knight gets on its best square. It's also worth mentioning that as the knight finds an advanced support point or outpost square farther down the board, it gains in strength. A knight on the back rank is pretty sad. It almost exclusively is doing defensive work on the back rank because it can guard either the second or the third rank and can't go further. And it can't rapidly be deployed to attack the enemy. It might take time. A knight on the second rank is kind of similar. You've probably seen like connected knights on f6 and d7 in some positions. I think keeping the knights connected is an overrated concept. I think a lot of people get the idea early on that having a knight on like a farther square and a knight behind that one is good. I don't think that's clearly the case because this means the knights are competing for squares. So when the knight is on the second line, and we're talking about from black's perspective, it's very likely that it's getting in the way of the other pieces. And the farthest it can possibly go from, for example, d7 is to the fourth rank from black's perspective. So still not a very active piece. Knights on the third, or in this case the sixth rank, they have a potential for attack and for defense. They're not necessarily doing one or the other. Knights that can get into the center are often pretty well placed. They start to become attacking pieces there. And then when they cross, they get stronger and stronger until a knight which is established on the 6th or 7th rank is often as strong as a rook and can lead to a great advantage. But that's only if the knight is occupying squares and attacking squares which are relevant to the conflict. For instance, if you have an outpost square or an advanced support point near where their king lives, and there are enough pieces to start an attack on the king, that could constitute a really great advantage. Here's another example, and we'll do this one again as a puzzle after discussing a little bit. So this is about the notion that knights are very good in cramped positions, closed positions. This position is definitely closed because you can see these pawns are all fixed. The only way that they are going to become unfixed is if some dramatic changes occur in the position, and they're not forced by any means. Pawn structure is definitely very fixed. So the knights can be better than the bishops, and sometimes better than the rooks even, in positions where the position's closed like this. Let's go a little further into the game. A lot of changes have occurred, but the pawn structure has stayed the same because it's a closed position. And black never managed to open it up. In fact, black ran into some tactical troubles, and now white has this really strong pawn on a6, which should constitute some kind of advantage. But how do we convert this advantage is the tricky part. And the answer hinges on where the knight is best placed. So first thing, before you figure out what white should play, you might want to ask yourself, where does the knight belong? What is the best place for it? And to answer questions like this, you shouldn't think necessarily about like, where's the knight now? Okay, what moves can it play? Don't think like that necessarily, but just survey the entire board and look for a place in the pawn structure where the knight cannot be chased away by a pawn ever, and where it's maybe able to attack weaknesses without being attacked. So you can pause here and look for a square like that. And I would say it's f5. Now, does this mean we should immediately go straight to the square f5? Not necessarily. In this example, white has an even stronger move, so again, you can pause if you want to think it over a little more. But the idea is to first trade queens. This is forced. They have to take. And now we're threatening to make a queen, so they have to stop it. And you might think this is kind of underwhelming because black has a pretty clear idea. They want to go here, and then they want to bring the king behind and take the pawn. And you might think, oh man, I'm just losing my pawn. But that takes a lot of time. And meanwhile, we have this really nice, you might even say juicy f5 square. So if we just go straight for it, how are they going to defend their king side if they're so busy attacking on the queen side? If this position were open, the bishop would dominate. It would be able to come clear across here and stop white from eventually getting a queen. But because the position's so closed, even though this is an exchange of pawns, it's worth it for black to resign here. This game was Selman versus Shindaki, and they really have nothing to do. You can see that it's going to take so long for them to defend. Meanwhile, f7's falling, g5's falling, h6, h7, h8 is happening. So the knight outplays the bishop in this really closed position. It helped that white was able to win a pawn along the way, which gives us that sort of puzzle quality. Otherwise, if white was not up a pawn, for example, if this pawn was on like a4 and black had a pawn on like a5, you might just bring the knight to f5 for strategic reasons, even though it doesn't win the game on the spot. In this case, it just does. Okay, now here's an example for knights being good blockaders. Now a blockade means that you're stopping the advance of your enemy pawns from a position where you cannot be chased away. That's an effective blockade. So here, again, it's bishop against knight, and probably white wants to advance this pawn at some point. I should also add that these pawns are weaknesses. Knights are really good at navigating positions where things are blocked up because of their ability to jump over. Even though they are very short range, they're one of the more powerful short range pieces, given their ability to leap over things, which bishops definitely can't do. So here, we can take advantage of that leapy power by going knight e8. And whatever they do, we're putting that knight on d6. And once the knight arrives on d6, not only does it attack these weaknesses, it prevents white from ever improving their pawn on d5. Let's see, I think I had another example here. Yeah, so this next one is about an anti-knight technique, which is probably especially useful for starting players who already have a vulnerability to the knights from a psychological standpoint. So when people are really good with knights against you and you constantly are falling for some knight problems, you should use the same way of thinking to help you find a good place for your knights, but use it in a prophylactic way, meaning that you are going to think about what your opponent wants to do with their knight and then stop it. And this is called Steinitz's anti-knight technique. The reason it's called Steinitz's is because this was suggested by the first ever world chess champion for the first time, at least as far as we know. History is sometimes a little convoluted. So, in a closed position, you're going to figure out where the knights belong pretty easily. They want to go on their outpost squares and their advanced support points. If the position is open, you could actually probably just let the knight kind of languish wherever it is, because your bishop should dominate in that situation. Just don't let them find a good place for the knight. So let's see. Here's a game, which is Smyslov against Rudakovsky. And we're just going to play through the opening here and come to a critical moment. So far, the position's all open. And here, black made a mistake. They played the move bishop c4. And this is a mistake because they need to try to get rid of the advanced support point for the knight. They need to keep it under control. So in this situation, where should they have gone? This is a good question. As a hint, white wants to play a move like knight d5 at some point. The answer is bishop d7, so that after white prepares the move knight d5, for instance, maybe with bishop f3, trying to play knight d5 next, you're going to just head them off. Well, they're not playing knight d5 next. First, they're going to play rook d1, so they can keep a piece on the outpost square if they get traded. But here after bishop c6, even if they do this, you can see that we have plenty of attack on the d5 square. You even have time to add in the move h6 to prevent them from playing the strong move bishop g5. Now they play bishop c4. And here, since white wants to play the knight onto an outpost square, what move should they play here? Another good moment to pause. The only thing stopping the knight from going on d5 is this knight, so we should play bishop g5. And what followed was kind of a textbook example of establishing a really good knight. Black was just suffering to find a good place for their bishop, and white was just activating the pieces for a kingside attack now that they have the pieces all activated. The knight on d5 keeps control of the whole board. So eventually they got an f6, which weakened the king. And then they cashed in. And they resigned here. The position's too good for white. Okay, I think I have another example here for the anti-knight technique. Well, here it's actually an exercise for white to play and find the best place for the knight and how to get there. So this is a little bit about maneuvering. So you might want to pause here and ask yourself, where does this knight on c3 belong and how do you get there? If you look at the pawn structure, it'll reveal that the knight belongs on a square like either b6 or d6. I would say b6 is too far from the action. You want your advanced support point to be near what's actually really happening in the position, whatever is critical here. So if you're on b6, it looks nice, but you're not attacking anything except the rook, and the rook can move to a better square. But if you're on d6, you're attacking b7, which is a long-term target because pawns are slow moving. So the way that we get there, again, you can pause if that hint helped you out. The way we get there is through b1. And we don't want to step on d2 because they can snap it off with the bishop. So we go to a3. And we bring the knight to where it belongs. Now here you might be saying, but wait, I thought you said we should only put the knight on an outpost square if it can't be traded away. Well, in this example, the bishop is black's only good minor piece, and if they trade it, which actually happened in the game, you end up with this really strong pawn on d6 as well, and the rooks are kind of frozen by white's space advantage. So you can sometimes transform the outpost square into a different kind of advantage. So white had a really great position here. It took them forever to convert, so I'm not going to bother showing that. Yeah, I think this is probably a good place to wrap this up, but maybe I'll just reiterate one thing about this last example. The key moment here for black was that they should try to keep control of the outpost square and try to deprive white of the opportunity to put the knight on d5. That's how things went so wrong in this game. So just to reiterate, we want to play a move like bishop d7 so that when the knight comes there, we can snap it off. In this case, it's a little different from the last example I showed, which was Botvinnik versus Floor. In this example, if we play the move, all right, let's pretend that we play h6, and then they put the knight on d5. You might be thinking, based on the other example, that maybe a pawn on d5 is giving white a good enough space advantage that they don't mind giving up the knight and the outpost square. Well, in this case, if they take, I don't think the space that white gets here is sufficient most of the time, because you really want that space to be even deeper in your opponent's territory, or else the knight on d5 is a better way of restricting your opponent's play compared to the pawn on d5. Also, in this example, the c2 pawn's hanging. So, I hope that clarifies everything and that you guys understand the knight and its personality a little bit better. There are a few things that the knight's good at, and other pieces are not so good at those things. So if you want to figure out where to place your knight, you need to consider these special aspects of the knight's short range ability, but also ability to jump over things, which is better in closed positions. And yeah, I guess that's it for now. So I'll put out a video later on probably about the personality of the other pieces, because all of them have these interesting properties that arise directly from the definition of how they move and their interaction with the other pieces. And yeah, I hope you enjoy my other content. Until next time, try to drop in for a live stream or something. Take care.